All right, we are here to talk chapter 4 of the Introduction to Mass Communication, Media Literacy, and Culture chapter. And this one is on newspapers. And so we're going to run through a brief history, a little bit how the newspaper has evolved over time, and where things kind of stand today. So, chapter 4, newspapers. Now, the earliest newspapers, we talked about this in some of the earlier chapters, were back in Caesar's time. Rome had a newspaper that was written on a tablet and posted on a wall after each Senate meeting. Now, things moved forward and progressed, and the modern day newspaper actually gained a lot of its traction back in the 1700s. But in colonial newspapers, that's really where we see a lot of the ones here in the United States coming into play. Now, the Boston Newsletter was published from 1704 until the Revolution. And in 1734, publisher John Peter Zenger criticized the colony's royal governor and was jailed for seditious libel. Now, if you've had journalism class, you know one of the court cases that we do go over is the trial of John Peter Zenger versus the governor of New York, William Cosby. And in this, the governor of New York, New York at the time, 1734, this was pre-independence of the United States. The governor of New York was not happy with something that was printed in John Peter Zenger's newspaper. It talked about how the governor of New York was corrupt and said some pretty unflattering things about him. And the governor was not real happy. Now, the governor, remember, answered to the King of England at the time. And so the governor decided they were not going to have the press be able to say whatever they wanted. And they ended up taking this toward a trial. And it was a trial of John Peter Zenger's peers, as the case was in this thing. And when it went to trial, John Peter Zenger's defense was that nothing that he was saying in the paper that was published and distributed was untruthful. He had facts backing up why he was saying the governor was corrupt and the kinds of problems there were going to be. And unlike life at time in Europe, where the government controlled things, the jury of peers of John Peter Zenger listened to this and came back and ended up, we the jury find you, John Peter Zenger, not guilty for seditious libel. And what they decided was that publications, newspaper publishers should be able to be one of those checks and balances with the government. And as long as what they were saying was built on a foundation of truth, they should be able to print what they want and be able to keep a check on government and other agencies that are out there. So you probably get a little bit more of that if you had journalism class, but John Peter Zenger, big forerunner of it. If you want to check out sometime who John Peter Zenger's, one of his lawyers was in this case, you might find that interesting as well if you give it a little Google. Now, in 1790, the Bill of Rights came in, and the First Amendment to the Constitution was born, the Declaration of Independence, right? And it's 45 simple words, but say so much. Again, we break this down in the intro journalism course. You've probably broken it down word for word with one of us in that course. But it reads, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, the freedom of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So it hits on 5 freedoms in there, and it really focuses on religion and press, speech, as well as assembly. And so you can see all of those with the details that are rooted in there. And that's where the Supreme Court comes in and other levels of the judicial branch to talk about what they meant when they were framing the First Amendment and what it means to have freedom of speech and freedom of the press. Now, it obviously does not mean the press can print absolutely anything that they want to print, but it does afford them a lot of freedoms. There are some things that just fall outside of that, like threats to national security, fighting words, things that are illegal products or services, right? Things of that nature. And yeah, just a few other things that you'll find in there that the courts over time have ruled on that have been deemed inappropriate, such as obscenity, for newspapers to print. Now, the modern day newspapers, another little bit about them. Benjamin Day's September 3rd, 1833 issue of the New York Sun was the first example of a penny press, cheap papers that were given out free, and well, not free, right? They were for a penny. And they started, I think if you've ever seen the movie Newsies, right? That Disney Movies musical. It's a good one to check out just to see some of how modern newspapers worked and were born, and with paper boys that were out there. Gordon Bennett's New York Morning Herald pioneered the correspondence system by placing reporters in D.C. and other major U.S. cities as well as abroad. We're going to see a little bit later in this chapter, we're going to talk about press agencies and things like that, but this New York Morning Herald was the first one that took its reporters and placed them in other places so that they could get news not only from the community that they were in, but they could have firsthand accounts in some of the largest, most important news areas around the country. Now, in 1827, the Freedom's Journal, the first African-American newspaper, was published by John Russwurm and the Reverend Samuel Cornish. And Frederick Douglass's The North Star, founded in 1847, was the most influential African-American newspaper before the Civil War. I find that interesting with the FHN newspaper, right, being called the North Star. It's been what it's called since its inception here at FHN, and I'm not sure what they were thinking when they came up with the name back in 1986, but it very well could have had something to do something with this, which is interesting. Or maybe they were just playing off of Francis Howell North. Wire services. Now, modern newspaper emerges with the development of wire services, and in 1948, 6 New York papers decided to pool efforts and share expenses. Other domestic wire services followed. The biggest one is the Associated Press. There's also UPI, there's International News Service, there's Reuters. You will see others of them out there. Now, the Associated Press, and I think if you've ever worked on editing a story ever or a cut line or something, you might have gotten a little note that talks about AP style needing to get fixed. Maybe it's how the month was written, or maybe how you had a number written. Maybe it was the date. Maybe it was a quantity of something. But basically, the Associated Press is an organization that employs journalists around the globe. These are designers, writers, photographers, videographers. And what it does is it has them stationed in countries all over the world, in cities all over the world. And what happens with that is there are journalists all over the world in all of these places who are able to write stories about things that are going on there at that place. And they write them for the Associated Press wire service. And then newspapers around the country can go on to and subscribe to the Associated Press, and they can pull stories off of that wire and run it in their own newspaper. Now, the benefit for newspapers like this, right, the benefit, for instance, for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch is if there is a war going on over in between 2 European countries, or a skirmish in the Middle East or something like that, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch doesn't have to get a reporter and fly them right over there and have all the expense of the flight and the hotel and food, just as long as, in addition to how long it would take to get somebody over there to cover it, there can be somebody with boots on the ground right there at the place, at the time, ready to send a story back to be able to appear in the newspaper at a much cheaper cost than it would be to send a reporter or a team of reporters over there. Now, these wire services are for sporting events, they're for news events, and they're even just for feature stories and even everything like obituaries. Now, while the benefit is wire services save a lot of money for publications, a drawback is that competing newspapers such as the St. Louis Post and Kansas City Star, if they are both on the news rack in Columbia, Missouri, right in the smack dab middle of the two cities, might have the same exact story in the publication. Even though they've saved a little money to run the big story, you aren't getting that fresh content, that fresh story that your competitors might not have in there. But not only can, someone grow up and work for a newspaper, for an online news magazine, a newspaper, but they can also grow up and work for the Associated Press and be stationed in one of their locations around the country or around the world. In 1883, Joseph Pulitzer. Pulitzer has a history here in St. Louis at the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. You should give that a Google and check that out as well as I'm not going to get all into yellow journalism here and what it is. A lot of you have heard about it probably in some of your other courses that you've taken. But Pulitzer adopted this populist approach and an activist style of coverage. It really is pretty interesting. I think you guys in some of your history courses have learned about this before, and even in some of your English courses. But yellow journalism is definitely a thing that you should take a peek at if you don't know anything about it. And I think you'd find it pretty interesting. Between 1910 and the early 40s, subscriptions doubled and ad revenues tripled. This really was the heyday for newspapers, and it was the beginning of really newspapers going from individual, independent publications to newspaper chains beginning to evolve. Now, 6 in 10 American adults read a daily paper every week, although not necessarily on the printed paper. That may be on the web. Daily print circulation has reached its lowest point currently since 1940. And the number of daily newspapers fell from 1,600 in 1990 to about 1,200 today. And we talk a lot about the newspaper industry changing and newspapers folding. Newspapers are being bought out by these hedge funds and these organizations, and what they do when they buy them a lot of times is they see them being able to be revenue streams for them, and so what they do is they try to find ways to cut back so that newspapers can generate even more money. And what a lot of times that means is it's laying off the journalists that are doing the work and have the boots on the ground every day. It doesn't mean that newspapers are dying or that they're going to die. There are lots of jobs out there for this. And what I have always talked about with everybody in here is that if you like writing, if you like photography, if you like video, there are tons of different jobs that are out there and available. Now, just because the newspaper industry is shrinking, it doesn't mean that it's not going away altogether. And I don't see the printed editions going away anytime soon. And if anything, a lot of the online news content that you're getting is evolving and it's expanding with places like The Athletic, right, that has sports journalists in really every college and professional beat that there is out there. But there's still a lot of great jobs open at newspapers around the country as well. Over 7,000 newspapers currently operate in the United States. 17% are dailies, 77% are weeklies, meaning they come out once a week, and 8% are semi-weekly. Now, while we'd love for a newspaper or a magazine or something like that for its main goal to be, what they were built to do, which is inform, entertain, and persuade, it is in the end a business. And as an advertising media, things have changed drastically in the last couple decades for publications. Print advertising revenues fell 62% from 2008 to 2018, but over $14 billion in annual ad sales suggest that advertisers find newspaper readers an attractive audience. 2/3 of Americans read a print or online paper every month, and 40% of all Americans read a print or online paper every day. Newspaper readers' incomes, home ownership rates, education levels, and employment rates are above the national average. Newspapers are local, serving supermarkets, car dealers, department stores, movie theaters, and other local merchants, which make them an attractive place for advertisers to get in front of their audiences to bring more people into their businesses. 82% of American households make regular use of printed newspaper circulars, which are the ads that get inserted into the newspapers. 35% of the newspaper is not filled with advertising, and content includes provided featured syndicate clearinghouses for the work of columnists, essayists, cartoonists, and other creative individuals. Now, trends and convergence in newspaper publishing. Industry has seen a dramatic decline in competition through the years. A lot of that has been because most cities are only able to support one newspaper, and a lot of the smaller papers in surrounding areas have got gobbled up and have gone away. St. Charles used to have its own newspaper that was out here for a long time, and it got gobbled up by the St. Louis Post-Dispatch a few years back. In 1923, to contrast that, 502 American cities had 2 or more competing dailies. And the Post, St. Louis had multiple newspapers, right? If you look at the St. Louis Post-Dispatch's name in and of itself, there's the St. Louis Post and the St. Louis Dispatch, and that's where you end up getting the hyphenation out of the 2 of them as they ended up merging back years ago. Anyway, of the large cities that are out there today, it's fewer than 12 American cities have competing newspapers. Now, there is fear that with newspapers will fail to successfully combat print's failing business model as younger readers turn toward the internet and social media. One of the biggest issues that newspapers had for a long time and still do have today, where they dug themselves a hole, was when the internet age came in and they started putting all of their stories up online for free for people to read. The issue was people then were just going online to read the same things that instead of subscribing to a newspaper that they could easily just go online to get. This video actually is one I remember seeing a long time back, and it is from when newspapers were first moving online, and I thought you guys might find it interesting. So let's hear this news report about this crazy thing of newspapers moving online.
Computer to,
excuse me, let me read.
if you will, sitting.
Okay, I thought this might be interesting. It was a news report I saw a while back, and it is this story, wild, right, about how newspapers are moving online, and I thought you guys might find interest in it. I think it's back from 1981.
Imagine, if you will, sitting down to your morning coffee, turning on your home computer to read the day's newspaper. Well, it's not as far-fetched as it may seem. In fact, both local San Francisco papers are investing a lot of money to try and get a service just like that started. Science editor Steve Newman reports on one person already using the brand new system.
17 stories up in his fashionable North Beach apartment, Richard Halloran is calling a local number that will connect him with a computer in Columbus, Ohio. Meanwhile, across town, in this less than fashionable cubbyhole at the San Francisco Examiner, these editors are programming today's copy of the paper into that same Ohio computer. When the telephone connection between these 2 terminals is made, the newest form of electronic journalism lights up Mr. Halloran's television with just about everything the Examiner prints in its regular edition. That is, with the exception of pictures, ads, and the comics. 8 newspapers around the country are currently in the computer network, and within the next few weeks, 3 others will join in.
This is an experiment. We're trying to figure out what it's going to mean to us as editors and reporters and what it means to the home user. And we're not in it to make money. We're probably not going to lose a lot, but we aren't going to make much either.
Both the Examiner and Chronicle began service within the last 2 weeks and printed full-page ads about it. Of the estimated 2,000 to 3,000 home computer owners in the Bay Area, the Chronicle reports over 500 have responded by sending back coupons. Even though the electronic newspaper isn't as spiffy looking as the ads imply, people using the system are excited about its potential.
With this system, we have the option not only of seeing the newspaper on the screen, but also optionally we can copy it. So anything we're interested in, we could go back in again and copy it onto paper and save it, which I think is the future of the type of interrogation an individual will give to the newspapers.
This is only the first step in newspapers by computer. Engineers now predict the day will come when we get all our newspapers and magazines by home computer, but that's a few years off. So for the moment at least, this fellow isn't worried about being out of a job. Steve Newman, News Center 4.
Well, it takes over 2 hours to receive the entire text of the newspaper over the phone, and with an hourly use charge of $5, the new telepaper won't be much competition for the 20-cent street edition.
I think there's so much of that that's so interesting. I think if you were to watch that over again and listen to what they are saying and talking about in 1981 of what they thought this new technology was going to mean, and then we look at it now a few decades later and what has it actually done to the industry, I think what I would love to hear from you here is what did maybe they get right, and or what did they get wrong? Now, somebody who believes, right, in what an amazing thing that the press does, I still do, for instance, subscribe to the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. I think it's like a Thursday through Monday subscription or something like that with the online digital access code and stuff as well. I want to support because I see there is value in that, and that those things are there. In full disclosure, I do not regularly open up the print newspaper and see what's there. I do from time to time. I look in there. I like looking at designs. I do like sitting and reading a paper from time to time, and I see things I might miss that I don't see online. But I do definitely go online most every day and check out and see what's going on with the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. But again, I think what newspapers are still trying to work through and figure out is, how do we make the online news publications, right, where we have to have all these photographers, we have to pay reporters, and we have to get them to get the news to help people know what's going on in our state legislatures and our school board meetings and at the Cardinal games and with the Blues and at the concert venues and all these things. How can we have a sustainable model where we are charging for online news and that people are willing to do that? And we see here with the notes here in this chapter that only 20% of Americans pay for an online news source. The internet empowers readers to control and interact with news, which has led to the traditional newspaper reinventing itself, converging with technology. And while the marriage of web and newspapers has not yet proved financially successful for the older medium, they are hoping that will get figured out in time. Right, they talk about the analog dollars, right? The analog newspaper would be getting dollars, to where digital, they are just getting dimes for the same thing. Newspapers on the web, we can have whole discussions on impressions, how many eyes show up on the website or on certain articles. We know about clickbait, just having overly sensational headlines to get somebody to click and read through the stories. Paywalls, a lot of news organizations do have paywalls where either they don't let you read anything on the website, or maybe they let you read 3 stories a month and then they close off the rest until the month expires. Micropayments to pay just a little bit for what you want to read, and integrated audience reach. All of those things factors in on what they are trying to do to build a sustainable model for their online publications. In terms of trends with electronic devices, 1 in 5 American adults owns an e-reader, 53% own a tablet, 85% have a smartphone. Most smartphone and tablet users access news via apps. More than 80% of U.S. adults get at least some of their news online. And Facebook is a regular source of news for 30%, 6% of Americans, and Twitter for the same role for another 15% that is out there. Reasons Americans pay for online news subscriptions. The biggest reason is better quality than they can get from free sources. They want to help fund good journalism and keep that going. And it is a convenient package for news and information. You get down with that later on. Maybe there's a particular journalist you like Derek Gould, who covers the St. Louis Cardinals for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, or maybe it's somebody else out there like Ken Fusen, who was an incredible feature writer for a long, long time. Maybe they're paying for it because they were offered a good deal or a trial. Payment was simple and easy. Maybe there's a great website or app. Maybe they need it for their job, or maybe there are some other member benefits that they get from it.